In the summer of 1862, thousands of runaway slaves poured into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Seeking freedom, they hoped the Union Army that was stationed there would provide them with promise and sanctuary. The town of Harper's Ferry would soon find itself in the crosshairs of the ongoing Civil War because of its key strategic location at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers. The fate of the thousands of people, known as contraband, would hang in the balance. Little could anyone know how their lives would change based on the events that would take place in the coming weeks in the very town in which they sought refuge. At this stage of the war, the Confederacy held its highest hopes for victory. After annihilating Union forces at the Second Battle of Bull Run, the audacious Robert E. Lee was now willing to gamble on an assault into the North. Lee's goals for this invasion were threefold. First, he wanted to give Northern Virginia farmers a break from the war. Secondly, he hoped to win support from European powers Britain and France. Finally, he hoped to push Abraham Lincoln into peace talks with the Confederacy. After careful planning and preparation, Lee distributed his plans to his staff in what became known as Special Orders 191.
That one piece of paper changes history in every direction. Every direction. It changes the history for the South, it changes the history for the North, it changes the history of Robert E. Lee, it changes the history of George McClellan, it changes the history of the Confederate nation, it changes the history of the United States, it changes the history of what happens to enslaved people. All that's through Special Order 191. It's an amazing document.
Lee's battle plans hinged around Harper's Ferry. The Union garrison of over 12,000 stationed in that town posed a serious threat to his supply lines in his proposed plan.
Special Order 191 never would have been issued without Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is an anchor around the Confederate Army that Lee has to cut loose. He's got to get rid of this anchor. It's slowing him down. It could potentially harm him. He's got to get rid of this problem in Harper's Ferry.
Lee planned for a full-scale invasion of Pennsylvania. As his forces met in Frederick, Maryland, he distributed Special Orders 191 to his officers. The plan was risky, but at this point in the war, Lee felt it was worth the gamble. Lee would proceed from Frederick with only a quarter of its army and then to Hagerstown, Maryland, less than 10 miles from the Pennsylvania border.
So when he came across the Potomac River as an invading force, he had no intention of spending much time in Maryland. He's going to Pennsylvania. All the evidence indicates that. Lee himself states it, tells the President of the Confederacy, I'm going to Pennsylvania. If you believe the Confederate press, Robert E. Lee is going to negotiate peace terms in Independence Square in Philadelphia.
Three-quarters of his army, led by Thomas Stonewall Jackson, would head to Harper's Ferry to flush out the Union troops and open a clear avenue of supply to Lee as he moved into Pennsylvania.
And that's when he issues Special Orders 191 at Frederick. That divides the army into 4 parts. He sends 3 parts to Harper's Ferry. The reason he sends 3 parts here is because there's 3 mountains that surround Harper's Ferry like a triangle. If he takes each one of those mountains, the Yankees get caught in the hole. This is not a sideshow. This is the show. Harper's Ferry is the show for Robert E. Lee at this moment.
Jackson was to accomplish this mission in just 3 days. Unfortunately for Lee, one of his officers inexplicably left his copy of Special Orders 191 behind at a camp just outside of Frederick. A Union cavalry patrol following the rebels stumbled upon the lost orders and gave them to General George McClellan. McClellan had just taken command of the Union Army for a second time following the debacle at Second Bull Run. Upon receiving the Confederate plans, McClellan stated, "Now I have the means to whip Bobby Lee." Clearly, time was not on the side of Robert E. Lee. As McClellan moved his men in position to divide the rebel army, Lee sat in Hagerstown totally unaware of the circumstances.
So, Jackson's moving on Harper's Ferry. Lee's at Hagerstown. Lee's poised to move north. When did Lee arrive in Hagerstown? September 11th. I mean, the Confederates had nobody to stop them. They're going north. They just have to get rid of this anchor. So once Harper's Ferry collapses, Jackson moves north to join Lee. The whole army goes north.
September 11th was quite possibly the darkest day of the Lincoln administration. Pennsylvania sat undefended and Lee sat poised to strike. Everything depended upon Stonewall Jackson's ability to remove the Union threat from Harper's Ferry. Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin was panicked. A Confederate tidal wave was about to crash upon Union soil. Their destination is Harrisburg or Philadelphia, Curtin distressed in a message to the president. Send here not less than 80,000 disciplined troops. Order from New York and states east all available forces here at once, Curtin further stated. The time for decided action by the national government has arrived. What may we expect? The answer was very little. Citizens were called to arms, but against the battle-hardened Army of Northern Virginia, the idea of peace negotiations in Independence Square looked ominously real. As Lee sat in Hagerstown, Jackson's forces moved on Harper's Ferry and after some intense fighting took the high ground. Maryland, Loudoun, and Bolivar Heights were soon in Confederate hands. Over 12,000 Union forces were now trapped, like rats in a cage, according to one unfortunate Yankee soldier. In the town of Harper's Ferry, citizens and contraband were in a state of panic, both uncertain of their future and how the next tense hours would play out. Jackson, however, was behind schedule. He now anticipated surrender from Union General Dixon S. Miles, who commanded the raw Yankee troops, but the capitulation was tardy. Finally, with Confederate guns poised to cut the Yankees into pieces, the white flags of surrender were unfurled on the morning of September 15th. Sadly, just as the Union command had agreed to surrender the linchpin of the Shenandoah Valley, a rebel shell exploded near Miles. The wound he suffered was mortal. The Union now had a convenient scapegoat, but Jackson had taken the prize. The anchor that was Harper's Ferry was lifted. Little did Jackson, already behind in the schedule laid out in Special Orders 191, or Robert E. Lee, realize that the main body of the Union Army under McClellan was moving between Jackson and Lee. McClellan, realizing the situation after reading the lost orders, was now in position to divide and conquer. The delay at Harper's Ferry would prove fatal. As word of McClellan's movement reached General Lee, and with only a quarter of his army available to fight, remaining in Hagerstown was suicide. He made the decision to move south and meet up with Jackson. Lee never anticipated this problem. Before reuniting his army, Lee's forces engaged the Union at the Battle of South Mountain. Badly undermanned, the Confederates staved off disaster, but hopes of invading Pennsylvania were all but lost. Had the delay at Harper's Ferry not occurred and had Special Orders 191 not been lost, the fate of the Confederacy may have been one of glory and victory instead of impending doom. After being bloodied at South Mountain, Lee's forces finally rejoined with the victorious troops of Jackson, but this was no time for celebration. They met near Antietam Creek in the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, with McClellan's Army of the Potomac poised to strike. On the morning of September 17, 1862, the Yankees did strike, and the battle raged the entire day. By day's end, over 22,000 casualties were suffered. It was the single bloodiest day in American history. On September 22, 1862, following the expulsion of the Confederates from Maryland, President Lincoln issued the preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. This document would transform the war into a revolution. In time, the thousands of runaway slaves known as contraband, who had once huddled under the mountains of Harper's Ferry, would be forever free. President Lincoln also had had enough of George McClellan. Yes, he forced Lee's army to retreat, but with Confederate plans in hand, Lincoln could not understand how he could not have ended the war. Frustrated, Lincoln replaced McClellan. In March of 1864, hundreds of black men moved into Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, the newest Union state. They were not runaways or even contraband. They were members of the U.S. colored troops marching triumphantly to the town now firmly entrenched in Union hands. How could anyone witnessing that glorious scene have realized the role Special Orders 191 had on transforming these men from slave to soldier in the service of the United States of America?